Before digging into the circumstances that brought Colonel Miles to his death at Harpers Ferry, it's necessary to understand the nature of the position he was assigned to hold and the attention the Union High Command actually gave it through the 4 campaigns of the war that affected it. In July 1861, as Lincoln was ordering his army of 3-month volunteers to go forth to battle a Confederate force holding the line of Bull Run, Robert Patterson, the 68-year-old commander of the Pennsylvania militia, had made an advance across the Potomac and Williamsport and engaged a brigade of Virginians, his force pushing them back toward Winchester. Patterson advanced his force as far as Bunker Hill and then veered away to Harpers Ferry, occupying the place on July 15 as Confederate General Joseph Johnston moved the Virginians by overland march to the line of the Manassas Gap Railroad and then taking cars the rest of the way to Manassas Junction, arriving on July 20 as the Battle of Bull Run was getting underway. In the course of these events, at Patterson's order, John Newton, a West Point graduate of the class of 1842 and at the time a captain of engineers in the regular army, made a personal inspection of the terrain of Elk Ridge. According to his report, Captain Newton ascended the western slope of the mountain by a road leading to Solomon's Gap, using a branch of it to proceed to the southwestward along the crest to the lookout, which sits on the high point of the summit about 4 miles from the gap. How wide a road it was, Newton's report does not say, but he tells us that to be used for military purposes, extensive repairs for hauling would have to be made to it before wagons and artillery could be moved on it. It would be this branch of the mountain road that Joe Kershaw and William Barksdale would use to bring the brigades into contact with the New Yorkers of the 126th Regiment, who would establish a line of defense along the crown of the mountain a mile or so north of the lookout in September 1862. Finding the crown of the mountain covered with a thicket of timber and brushwood, making movement of a line of battle difficult to maintain in order, Newton reported that an easy defense could be made by cutting down the timber and clearing the brushwood across the summit for about 200 yards in width, and forming what he called a light parapet at the southern edge of the clearing, high enough to protect the heads of the men. The principal defense, he concluded, would be the felling of trees. In his exploration of the mountain, Newton returned to the gap and rode his horse down the eastern slope, finding the road wider but steeper than the road on the western slope. Reaching the floor of Pleasant Valley, he turned to the south and rode along the base to Sandy Hook, where he discovered a rough road recently cut through the woods that wound up the eastern slope at the toe of the mountain and ended on Maryland Heights. He found this road less steep than the road leading up to Solomon's Gap, but it was roughly constructed, having large stones 6 feet long in many places directly in the road. It appears probable that this is the road that Barksdale used to move 2 field pieces up to Maryland Heights on September 14, 1862, the carriage of one of the pieces being badly damaged in the process, so that only 1 gun actually was unlimbered into action. In his exploration, Newton found no water source available on the crown of the mountain itself, but he did discover several springs near the base of the mountain at Sandy Hook, which would have to be guarded by a Union force, and the water hauled up the mountain to the lookout and other positions the Union men might develop for defense. Newton's report ends with a statement of his view that while the mountain afforded capabilities for a strong defense, creating the defenses would take considerable time given the extent of the ground to be covered, the sorry condition of the mountain roads, and the necessity of hauling water, stores, and ammunition up the mountain. Not to mention the problem of bringing the artillery up the mountain with teams of horses. Newton estimated that as he envisioned the work to be done, 2,000 men would be required to work about 10 days to get the necessary work completed. Newton's report lay in the War Department's inbox with no action taken from the time it was filed until the report was received in late May 1862 that Stonewall Jackson, with 3 divisions of infantry, numbering about 17,000 men, had swept through Front Royal, driving the Union General Nathaniel Banks' outposts running for Winchester. Then, coming upon Banks' main body and routing it, sending Banks running for the Potomac, which he crossed the last week of May, as Jackson then turned his column to the northeast and came upon Harper's Ferry. In the interim between Jackson's arrival at Front Royal and his arrival at Harper's Ferry, Lincoln and Stanton sent a man named Rufus Saxton, a recently made Brigadier General of Volunteers, to take command of the Union force, then occupying the place under the command of Colonel Miles. Saxton brought with him 3 pieces of heavy rifled artillery, which he had placed in battery on a shelf on the west slope of the mountain at 400 feet of elevation. The mountain rising to an elevation of 1,400 feet at the lookout, some 2 miles north of the battery's location. Jackson, for his part, was well familiar with the details of the ground at and around Harper's Ferry, and he knew, as all reasonably intelligent soldiers knew, that Harper's Ferry was a trap for any military force that sought to hold it, for the simple reason that it was surrounded by high mountains which provided platforms for artillery to rain shells down on the defenders wherever they positioned themselves. Like Jackson, Saxton and certainly Miles understood the tactical problem created by the mountains entirely. And as soon as he arrived, Saxton ordered the whole Union infantry force to abandon Boulevard Heights and, leaving a battery of artillery on Camp Hill, concentrate them at the heavy battery of guns established on Elk Ridge. In doing this, Saxton knew the strategic value of the ferry could be most efficiently protected for the simple reason that the 3 heavy guns, in conjunction with field pieces in action, would provide a curtain of fire that would result in the enemy sustaining heavy casualties if they attempted to reach the railroad bridge to plant explosives, and it would make it impossible for an infantry column of the enemy to pass over the bridge to march through Sandy Hook into Pleasant Valley. Of course, the enemy infantry, having established themselves on Boulevard Heights, might move forward to seize possession of Camp Hill. But as they crossed the intervening ground, taking fire from the artillery limbered there, and without artillery and counter battery, throwing shells on Camp Hill from Loudon Heights, it is certain that the endeavor would prove to be a costly one. And in any event, Jackson had no time to waste attempting it. In May 1862, his purpose of being there had nothing to do with the idea of engaging in battle to capture the place. He was there simply because it was as far as he could take his force northward before retreating to escape the Union forces converging in Spencer's to block his access to the upper valley, trapping him in the lower valley and with superior numbers annihilating his force. A year later, in June 1863, when the Confederate Army came down the valley to the Potomac, 80,000 strong, General Milroy's force at Winchester is crushed as Ewell's corps surges past, and he retreats to Harpers Ferry, where Brigadier General Dan Tyler, who we last heard of commanding the Union division at the Stone Bridge during the Battle of Bull Run, is in command. As Ewell's corps crosses the Potomac at Williamsport and moves on toward Chambersburg, and Hill's corps begins to appear at Shepherdstown, Tyler orders his force of 8,000 men to abandon Harper's Ferry, as Saxton had before him, and take the position Saxton held in May 1861 on Elk Ridge. Now, though the Union War Department had engineers make an investigation of the ground of Elk Ridge following the Battle of Antietam, by the time Lee's army arrived at the Potomac in June 1863, none of the recommendations the engineers had made to improve the defenses of the mountain had been authorized. After that battle, McClellan had pressed Halleck to convince the Lincoln government to spend some $50,000 constructing a line of defense stretching from the Potomac River, where it bends around the mountain, to its eastern slope, adding to it a 6-gun battery of 30-pounder Parrots to rain shells on the crest of Loudoun Heights. But nothing of much substance was actually done. In any event, General Lee had no interest in wasting time fiddling with Harper's Ferry, as the Union's occupation of the place had no relevance under the circumstances existing at that moment. These same circumstances existed a year later when Jubal Early came down the valley with 20,000 men. Early's force swept up to the Potomac in July 1864, and as it arrived, Max Weber, the ferry's garrison commander, immediately evacuated the place to take position on Elk Ridge, though finally by this time he had the benefit of stronger lines with several new batteries of artillery in place to suppress enemy fire from Loudoun Heights and to better secure the flanks of the Union position. But none of this mattered to Early, who moved his divisions across the river at Sharpsburg and moved directly to the South Mountain and went over it into the Middleton Valley and on through Frederick, overpowering Lew Wallace, who then commanded the Middle Department, and came out to meet him at the Monocacy, pressing on like a surging wave right up to the forts girdling Washington, and then receding, flowing back into Virginia, through Leesburg, and crossing the Blue Ridge back into the valley. So we end this with the ultimate question yet to be answered. How is it that in 3 of these 4 campaign seasons, as Confederate forces approached Harper's Ferry, the Union officers commanding the garrison at the place abandoned it? Saxton, Tyler, Weber ordering the garrison to concentrate on Elk Ridge, and the Lincoln government did not cashier any of them from the service, much less characterize their action as imbecilic or treasonous or cowardly. And yet, it would destroy the reputation of the one officer who held the place in the one situation where the Confederates actually surrounded it with 3 times the numbers under the officer's command. Indeed, we must answer the harder question. The more immutable question. Why did Colonel Dixon Miles not immediately concentrate his force on Elk Ridge the moment he knew the enemy would shortly be appearing in massed force in front of Bolivar Heights?